We often mistake explosive anger for strength, but in reality, the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. In the early 19th century, the French Empire spanned the continent. At its helm was Napoleon Bonaparte, the undisputed and seemingly invincible master of Europe. But operating quietly in his shadow was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, a calculating and brilliant foreign minister who rarely raised his voice. While the public cheered the endless military campaigns, Talleyrand privately recognized a grim reality. He saw that the emperor's unyielding ambition was stretching the empire to its breaking point and would eventually guarantee the ruin of France. Napoleon commanded through physical dominance and military might, but Talleyrand suspected that the empire's survival would eventually require a different, quieter form of control. Talleyrand faced an impossible problem. He knew the emperor had to be stopped to save the country, but he could not directly strike at a sitting ruler without facing the guillotine, so he engineered an unorthodox solution. He formed an alliance with his most hated rival, Joseph Fouché, the head of the secret police. Talleyrand then made sure that word of this treasonous meeting quietly leaked. He knew his target's psychological makeup perfectly and understood exactly how this information would manipulate him. When the news reached him, Napoleon flew into a frantic, paranoid panic. Completely thrown off balance by the betrayal, he rushed back to Paris to confront his rogue ministers. He summoned his government to the palace, setting the stage for a clash within the grand, highly formal, aristocratic environment of the French court. Talleyrand didn't need to raise a rebel army to attack his leader. He only needed to trigger the emperor's own deep-seated paranoia to force an unforced error. The tension in the room was suffocating as the shocked emperor burst through the doors to face his cabinet. Napoleon immediately began pacing up and down, aggressively rambling about hidden plots, and trying to intimidate his subordinates into confessing their treason. In stark contrast to this erratic behavior, Talleyrand simply leaned casually against the mantelpiece. He stared back at the ruler, projecting a look of complete boredom and indifference. Seeing a subordinate remain completely serene in the face of a hanging offense pushed Napoleon over the edge. This calculated apathy fractured his composure entirely. The ruler exploded. He stepped closer, screaming insults directly into his minister's face, ultimately shouting that Talleyrand was nothing but shit in a silk stocking. The man who had conquered nations was now reduced to screaming insults at a silent subordinate, losing his composure in front of his entire government. Talleyrand did not flinch. He did not defend himself, and he did not argue back. He absorbed the abuse and remained perfectly silent. Feeling he had successfully humiliated his minister, Napoleon turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, falsely believing he had won the encounter. As the doors closed, Talleyrand turned to the terrified court and delivered a devastating, deadpan assessment. "What a pity, gentlemen, that so great a man should have such bad manners." Napoleon walked away satisfied, unaware that his outburst had just signaled to everyone watching that he was no longer in control of his own emotions. That afternoon became a permanent historical turning point. Napoleon inadvertently shattered his own aura of invincibility, forever losing the respect of his inner circle. As this passage detailing the conspiracy highlights, Talleyrand capitalized on this newly exposed vulnerability. Using the emperor's lack of self-control as leverage, he began secretly negotiating with Russia and Austria to engineer his former master's ultimate defeat. This historical episode illustrates Law 39 from the 48 Laws of Power: stir up waters to catch fish. Making an enemy angry while staying calm yourself grants a decided advantage. Anger is not a display of power. It is a sign of helplessness that severely limits your strategic options, forcing you to react instead of plan. Conversely, remaining unmoved by someone else's rage makes you appear untouchable. It allows you to find the chink in their vanity, rattle them, and ultimately hold the strings. True power lies not in reacting explosively to the storm, but in remaining objective enough to control the weather. The next time you are attacked, mirror Talleyrand. Do not react. Smile, Stay silent and watch your attacker drown in their own turbulence. But what if the danger isn't an angry, aggressive opponent? What if the threat is someone who seems perfectly happy, but constantly brings disaster to everyone around them? In our next video on Law 10, the infection, we'll reveal why you must avoid the unlucky at all costs, and how trying to save a drowning person might just pull you under. Napoleon Bonaparte survived wars that wiped out entire generations. He walked away from blinding blizzards, assassination attempts, and the combined military might of Europe. But the man who conquered a continent was broken in a quiet room by an opponent who simply smiled. Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power identifies this vulnerability. Law 39 states that losing your temper is strategic suicide. It transfers control directly to your enemy. Power at this level isn't measured in muskets. It's measured in the distance you can put between your feelings and your decisions. To stay in command, a leader must look at a direct threat and feel nothing. By 1809, the French Empire spanned the continent, yet Napoleon was bogged down in a frustrating, irrational war in Spain that drained his resources and his patience. Back in Paris, his two most calculating and ruthless ministers, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand and Joseph Fouché, were left largely unsupervised. Then, a deeply unsettling rumor reached the front lines. These two bitter rivals had formed a secret alliance. The thought of his own men conspiring against him triggered immediate paranoia. Napoleon abandoned his military campaign, mounted his horse, and rode himself to exhaustion all the way back to Paris, arriving completely off balance. Reacting blindly to fear and hearsay is always a miscalculation. It forces you to make moves based on another person's timeline, handing them the leverage before a single word is even spoken. On January 28th, Napoleon summoned his Privy Council to the palace. The ministers arrived expecting a routine meeting, but the atmosphere in the room was thick and suffocating. The emperor entered the room pacing erratically. He started rambling. He threw out vague accusations about plots, about speculators undermining the economy, and ministers committing treason. While the other men froze, Talleyrand stood off to the side, leaning on the mantelpiece. He looked entirely indifferent, calm, even a little bored. This is the mechanical trap of Law 39. By projecting serenity while someone else is agitated, your indifference acts as bait. It practically demands that the aggressor escalate to force a reaction. And escalate he did. Instead of a calculated political dismissal, Napoleon unleashed a violent, hour-long temper tantrum. He closed the distance, stepping right up to his foreign minister and screaming directly into his face. He accused Talleyrand of selling his own father for profit, of lacking faith, and ultimately screamed out the infamous insult, "You are nothing but shit in a silk stocking." Through an hour of this extreme provocation, Talleyrand did not flinch. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself, and he showed zero anger. He remained completely formless, like water absorbing a stone. Talleyrand's composure forced Napoleon to exhaust all of his aggressive energy against a blank wall. By letting his rage dictate the meeting, Napoleon surrendered his reputation for being untouchable. His court saw a man reduced to shouting at a stationary target, a display that stripped away his authority more effectively than any military defeat. Out of breath and utterly ineffective, Napoleon eventually turned and stormed out of the room. He left behind a deafening, stunned silence among the surviving ministers. Talleyrand slowly limped across the floor to grab his cloak, turned to the terrified men and whispered, "What a pity, gentlemen, that so great a man should have such bad manners." That single afternoon erased years of careful psychological dominance. The illusion of the emperor as a man in total control was permanently shattered. True power relies heavily on the perception of control. The very second you publicly display helplessness through blind rage, your authority evaporates. This marked the moment the infallible emperor died. Word of his loss of control spread instantly, eroding the fear that held his empire together, starting a chain of defections culminating at Waterloo. Tantrums never inspire loyalty. These stormy eruptions don't display strength. They expose weakness. Think about the last time you found yourself in a tense argument. Did you lose your leverage the exact moment you raised your voice first? Controlling your response is the only way to keep the initiative in any conflict. But what happens when a downfall comes from being too polished, too flawless? To see how perfection breeds silent enemies, click here to explore the breakdown of Law 46.